The Trump administration is squaring off against Fed Governor Lisa Cook at the Supreme Court today over President Trump's effort to fire Cook.
Today, at this very moment, the Supreme Court of the United States is hearing oral arguments in a case that could fundamentally reshape the balance of power in America. And I want to be absolutely clear about what's happening. President Donald Trump is trying to fire Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook, not because she violated any law, not because she committed misconduct, but because he doesn't like the decisions she's making about monetary policy. And if he succeeds, the independence of the Federal Reserve, one of the few institutions still standing between American economic stability and complete presidential control, could be destroyed forever. This isn't hyperbole. This isn't partisan spin. Federal Reserve governors from both Republican and Democratic administrations are sounding the alarm. They're saying, in no uncertain terms, that the independence of American monetary policy itself is on the line. We're not talking about a routine personnel dispute. We're talking about whether a president can simply remove an independent economic regulator because he disagrees with their decisions. And the implications of this case extend far beyond Lisa Cook, far beyond the Federal Reserve, and directly into the question of whether any independent agency in the United States government can remain truly independent. The Supreme Court justices are deliberating this question right now, and what they decide will either reinforce a century of established precedent protecting institutional independence, or it will open the floodgates for presidential power, unlike anything we've seen in modern American history. Let me explain exactly what's going on here, because the legal complexity of this case is being used to obscure what is actually a very simple power grab. Lisa Cook is a Federal Reserve governor. She was nominated by President Biden and confirmed by the Senate in 2022. Federal Reserve governors serve 14-year terms specifically designed to insulate them from political pressure. This isn't an accident of history. It's the entire point. The Federal Reserve was structured this way precisely so that presidents couldn't threaten or fire Fed officials who make monetary policy decisions they don't like. The independence of the Fed is supposed to protect the American economy from being manipulated for short-term political gain. The Federal Reserve Act, the law that governs how the Fed operates, states that governors can only be removed for cause. That's the key phrase, for cause. In legal terms, this means a governor can only be fired for serious misconduct, neglect of duty, or malfeasance. It doesn't mean a president can fire them because they raised interest rates when the president wanted them lowered. It doesn't mean they can be removed because they're making economic decisions the president finds politically inconvenient. President Trump attempted to fire Lisa Cook anyway. The administration has argued that the president has the constitutional authority to remove any executive branch official at will, that these statutory protections limiting removal for cause are themselves unconstitutional restrictions on presidential power. They're essentially claiming that the president's Article 2 powers override Congress's ability to create independent agencies with job protections for their leaders. And now the Supreme Court, the same Supreme Court that has issued a series of decisions expanding executive power, the same court that granted presidents broad immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts, is deciding whether Trump can do this. Here's where this gets serious, and I need everyone to understand the stakes. The Federal Reserve's independence isn't some bureaucratic nicety. It's not a technicality. It exists because history has taught us repeatedly and painfully what happens when monetary policy becomes a political tool. When presidents can threaten central bankers into keeping interest rates artificially low before elections, you get inflation, you get boom and bust cycles, you get economic instability that devastates working families. You get the kind of monetary manipulation that has destroyed currencies and economies in countries around the world. The reason the United States has had relatively stable monetary policy for decades, the reason the dollar is the world's reserve currency, the reason international markets trust American economic institutions, is because the Federal Reserve operates independently from political pressure. Investors, businesses, and foreign governments trust that the Fed will make decisions based on economic data, not based on what's politically convenient for whoever is in the White House. If Trump can fire Lisa Cook simply because he doesn't like her vote on interest rates, that independence evaporates completely, overnight. And this is the part no one can ignore. It doesn't stop with the Fed. There are independent agencies throughout the federal government that operate on this same legal structure. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which protects Americans from predatory lending and financial fraud. The National Labor Relations Board, which enforces workers' rights to organize. The Federal Trade Commission, which prevents monopolistic behavior and corporate abuse. The Securities and Exchange Commission, which regulates Wall Street. All of these agencies have leaders who serve fixed terms and can only be removed for cause. The exact same legal protection Trump is challenging right now. If the Supreme Court rules in Trump's favor, all of those protections collapse. Every single independent regulator becomes subject to presidential control. A president could fire the head of the SEC for investigating his business associates. A president could remove the chair of the FTC for blocking a merger involving his supporters. A president could purge the NLRB for defending union rights when he wants to side with corporate donors. The entire architecture of independent economic regulation, built over a century to prevent exactly this kind of concentrated presidential power, could be dismantled with a single Supreme Court decision. Let's talk about what we actually know, because the facts here are damning. Trump has made no secret of his view that the Federal Reserve should be under his control. During his first term, he repeatedly attacked Fed Chair Jerome Powell, whom Trump himself appointed, for not cutting interest rates fast enough. Trump publicly called Powell an enemy of America, compared him to Chinese President Xi Jinping, and demanded that the Fed lower rates to boost the economy before the 2020 election. This wasn't private frustration. These were public threats designed to pressure the Fed into compliance. When Trump returned to office, he escalated. He didn't just criticize, he acted. The attempt to fire Lisa Cook is the logical extension of his long-standing belief that he should control monetary policy. And here's what makes this particularly transparent. Lisa Cook is an accomplished economist. She has a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. She taught at Michigan State University. She served on President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors. She was confirmed by the Senate through the constitutional process. There is no allegation, none, that she has committed any misconduct or violated any law. The only reason Trump wants her gone is that she votes in ways he disagrees with. That's it. That's the entire case. The administration's legal argument relies heavily on the unitary executive theory, the idea that all executive power must be controlled directly by the president, and that Congress cannot create independent agencies that limit presidential removal authority. This theory has been gaining ground in conservative legal circles and at the Supreme Court. In recent years, the court has chipped away at agency independence. In Saylor Law v. CFPB in 2020, the court ruled that the single director structure of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, with a director removable only for cause, violated the separation of powers. The court allowed the CFPB to continue operating, but struck down the removal restriction. But the Federal Reserve is different. It's not led by a single director accountable to no one. It's governed by a board of multiple members with staggered terms. This structure has been upheld repeatedly as constitutional. The Fed's independence has survived legal challenges for decades, precisely because it's structured to prevent any one person or political faction from dominating it. What Trump is asking the court to do is overturn that precedent entirely. He's asking the court to declare that no executive branch official, not Fed governors, not agency directors, not anyone, can be insulated from presidential removal. And if the court's conservative supermajority accepts this argument, the implications are staggering. Here's where everything changes. Because this isn't happening in a vacuum, Trump isn't just targeting Lisa Cook. The broader project of his administration has been to consolidate executive power across every institution that might serve as a check or balance. We've watched him purge inspectors general who investigate executive branch misconduct. We've seen him threaten career civil servants who provide independent analysis. We've witnessed his administration systematically dismantle oversight mechanisms and ethics guardrails. The attack on Fed independence is part of a pattern of demanding personal loyalty over institutional integrity, and the timing matters. Trump is doing this while he's already facing multiple investigations, while his business interests continue to intersect with government policy, while questions about his financial dealings remain unresolved. An independent Federal Reserve, one that can't be threatened or controlled, is an obstacle to the kind of economic manipulation that could benefit Trump personally. And the Fed governors know this. That's why you're seeing an unprecedented display of bipartisan alarm. Former Fed officials appointed by Republican presidents are speaking out. They're warning that this threatens the fundamental credibility of American monetary policy. They're saying that if the Fed becomes politicized, if its decisions can be second-guessed or reversed by presidential interference, the entire global financial system's trust in U.S. economic management will be undermined. Think about what that means. The U.S. dollar's status as the world's reserve currency depends on confidence in American institutions. If the Federal Reserve becomes a political arm of the White House, if its decisions are made based on what's good for the president rather than what's good for the economy, why would other countries continue to hold dollars? Why would international investors trust American bonds? Why would foreign central banks continue to anchor their own policies to Fed decisions? This exposes a much bigger problem. Trump's consistent pattern of attacking and undermining any institution that operates independently from his direct control. Courts, inspectors general, intelligence agencies, now the Federal Reserve. The through line is clear. Any institution that might say no to presidential power must be brought to heel or destroyed. The Supreme Court is now facing a decision that will define the scope of presidential power for generations. If the court rules for Trump, if it says he can fire Lisa Cook without cause, the precedent is catastrophic. It means that any president can remove any independent regulator at any time for any reason. It means that agencies created by Congress to operate independently from political pressure can be turned into instruments of presidential will overnight. It means that the next Democratic president, or the president after that, or the president after that, will have the same unchecked removal authority. This isn't about Trump alone. This is about fundamentally restructuring the American administrative state to concentrate power in the presidency. If the court rules against Trump, if it upholds the for-cause removal protections, it would reinforce a century of legal precedent and preserve the independence of economic regulators. It would affirm that Congress has the constitutional authority to structure agencies with job protections that insulate expert decision-makers from political interference. It would protect the Federal Reserve's ability to make monetary policy decisions based on economic conditions rather than political calculation. But here's the reality. This Supreme Court has shown a consistent willingness to expand presidential power and curtail regulatory authority. The conservative supermajority has demonstrated hostility to independent agencies in case after case. They've embraced theories of executive authority that would have been considered radical just a decade ago. And they've shown particular deference to Trump specifically in cases involving presidential immunity and executive privilege. The oral arguments happening today will give us some insight into where the justices are leaning. We'll hear questions about the scope of Article 2, about congressional authority to structure the executive branch, about the historical practice of independent agencies. But we should be clear-eyed about the composition of this court and its track record. If Trump wins this case, the timeline for dismantling independent regulation is immediate. Within weeks, potentially within days, you could see a wave of removals across independent agencies. Any regulator who has crossed the administration, any agency head who has pursued enforcement actions against Trump allies, any commissioner who has sided with consumer protections over corporate interests, all of them become vulnerable. The threat of removal becomes a tool of control. Even if officials aren't immediately fired, the knowledge that they can be fired at any time fundamentally changes how they do their jobs. For the Federal Reserve specifically, the consequences would be profound. Financial markets would immediately begin pricing in political risk that doesn't currently exist. Interest rates would likely become more volatile as investors try to guess whether Fed decisions are based on economics or politics. The dollar could weaken as other countries question the Fed's independence. Inflation expectations could become unmoored if the market believes the Fed will cave to presidential pressure to keep rates low. And beyond the Fed, we're talking about the collapse of regulatory independence across the entire federal government. Environmental enforcement becomes subject to presidential whim. Financial regulation bends to whoever occupies the White House. Worker protections depend on the political preferences of the president rather than the law. Consumer safety becomes negotiable based on corporate political connections. This is not an exaggeration of what's at stake. This is a straightforward description of what the end of for-cause removal protections would mean in practice. If Trump loses this case, the immediate crisis is averted, but the attack on independent institutions will continue through other means. We're already seeing legislative proposals to restructure agencies, budget fights designed to defund regulatory enforcement, and executive orders attempting to reclassify civil servants to make them easier to fire. This case is a critical battle, but it's part of a larger war over whether the United States will maintain a professional, expert-driven administrative state or whether it will consolidate all executive power under direct presidential control. Let me be absolutely clear about what's happening here. This case is about more than Lisa Cook's job. It's about more than the Federal Reserve. It's about whether we will maintain the institutional structures that prevent authoritarian control of government. Independent agencies exist because democracies need institutions that can operate on principle rather than political convenience. When regulators can make decisions without fear of being fired for doing their jobs correctly, they can protect consumers from fraud, workers from exploitation, investors from manipulation, and the economy from politically motivated manipulation. When those protections are removed, when every decision maker answers directly to the president, you don't have a democracy with checks and balances. You have an executive with unchecked power over every aspect of governance. The Federal Reserve's independence has been a pillar of American economic stability for over a century. It's the reason we've avoided the kind of hyperinflation that has devastated other countries. It's the reason monetary policy isn't yanked back and forth with every election cycle. It's the reason the U.S. dollar is trusted globally as a stable store of value. Trump is trying to tear that down, not because it's broken, not because it's failed, but because it stands in the way of his absolute control. And the Supreme Court is deciding right now whether to let him. The oral arguments taking place today will give us our first real indication of where this court is heading. Listen to the questions the justices ask. Pay attention to which justices seem skeptical of unlimited presidential removal power and which ones embrace it. Watch for how the court's conservative majority frames the balance between presidential authority and congressional power to structure agencies. But don't wait for the court's final decision, which likely won't come for months, to understand the stakes. This story is unfolding in real time, and what happens in that courtroom today will echo for decades. If the court sides with Trump, the transformation of American government will be swift and sweeping. Independent regulators will become an endangered species. The Fed's ability to control inflation, maintain employment, and stabilize financial markets will be compromised by political interference. And every future president will inherit the same unchecked removal power, creating permanent instability in how our government functions. If the court protects Lisa Cook's job and the Fed's independence, it will be a rare victory for institutional stability in an era of escalating power grabs. But even that victory won't end the assault on independent agencies. It will just force the fight into other arenas. This is one of those moments where the architecture of American democracy is being tested, where long-standing norms and legal protections are being challenged by a president who views institutional independence as an obstacle rather than a safeguard, where the Supreme Court must decide whether to reinforce the structures that prevent authoritarian control or to dismantle them. The walls are closing in, not on Trump, but on the independent institutions that have protected American democracy and economic stability for generations. What the Supreme Court decides in this case will determine whether those walls hold or whether they come crashing down. This story isn't over. The justices will deliberate. A decision will be issued, and the consequences will be felt across every corner of American government and economic life. Stay informed, pay attention to this case, because what happens next will shape the balance of power in America for the rest of our lives. The next move will be critical, and it's happening right now.